Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'm Cathy Blake. I'm Director of Campus Planning and Design and the University Landscape Architect here at Stanford. Welcome to the second lecture of our 2023 Architecture, Landscape Architecture Spring Lecture Series. The theme of this year's lecture series is materiality. Since the dawn of human race, we have harvested the natural materials around us in order to craft shelters that would protect us from the elements. 400,000 years later, we have evolved to the point where the choice of building materials is almost limitless and can be sourced from the other side of the planet if we desire. We asked our speakers to consider how they approach materiality in their design process and what it expresses about program, place, culture, and more. I hope that's what Michael talks about, but maybe not. We're honored to have such outstanding professionals join us this spring to reflect on the significance of materiality in their design approach and body of work. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Dave Lennox, Zach Posner, and Padma Kadidapudi from our office, University Architect and Campus Planning, as well as John Barton and Jeffrey Tuttle from the Architecture Design Program to help organize this series. I'd also like to thank the American Society of Landscape Architects for sponsoring a pre-event gathering for this lecture, and the American Institute of Architects Santa Clara Valley chapter for their help advertising the series and providing and registering people for continuing professional education. Please sign the sheets on that wall on the clipboard if you need continuing education credits. Our next lecture is in 2 weeks, and we're pleased to have Mei-Jin Yoon from Howler and Yoon. This one will be held in the Denning House, not here. The Denning House is on the opposite side of campus near Lake Lagunita, and look that up, and Zach tells me there will be a maximum number of people that can attend that lecture. So don't come late, and it's a beautiful venue. Okay, and so now it's my pleasure, after all that, to introduce Michael Boland. Unlike many past speakers, Michael holds a position much like those in LBRE here at Stanford, representing the owner specifically for the physical transformation of the Presidio in San Francisco. He works with an interdisciplinary internal team and some of the most talented consultants across the country. Since 2001, Michael Boland has played a key role in transforming the historic Presidio Army Base into a world-class national park site. As Chief of Park Development, he leads teams to create comprehensive visitor facilities, restore natural and cultural landscapes, develop park experiences serving urban youth and their families, and basically reinventing the Post as a unique, self-sufficient national park for all. We recently, my group, visited a tour that Michael led of the new and must-see Tunnel Tops project in San Francisco. This is an amazing resource that I'm sure Michael will share more about, and I encourage you to visit that. Prior to the Presidio, Michael worked for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, managing projects including Crissy Field, the Alcatraz Master Plan, and the National AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park. Michael has a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture, a Master of Landscape Architecture, and a Master of City Planning, all from UC Berkeley. And he is a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Boland. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, hello everyone. Is this working? Yes. All right, great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. I had this fantastic tour of the campus this afternoon before I came, and also got to meet with the class. So for those of you I saw in the class, nice to see you again. And what an incredible place, you stewards of this place. Incredible, I love this oak savanna dotted with these amazing buildings, you know. What a campus it is. So anyway, as was mentioned, well, we've moved ahead. All right. I'm delighted to be here today to talk a little bit about the transformation of the Presidio. And whether or not I talk at all about materiality, we'll see. But what I do want to talk about is how you take a derelict Army base, a very complex landscape, a very multi-dimensional landscape, set in the middle of a very complex, a very multi-dimensional community and region, and transform it into a national park that is really a gateway for everyone, and especially a gateway for people that historically, in our community, that historically have not had access to national parks or felt welcome in national parks. So that's the overall arc of the story. You can leave now if you're, if you're hungry. But more seriously, but I want to take you on a bit of a journey, because the journey of the Presidio is a really interesting one. And it's really been my privilege to be involved from the very beginning. My first day in the park was the Monday after the Loma Prieta earthquake, which is the same year that the closure of the Presidio was announced. So I've really been along for this amazing journey, and it's really been a privilege to be part of it. So just quick, a little history lesson about the Presidio. The site of the Presidio today, up until 1776, was known as Yelamu, and it was inhabited by the Yelamu, which were a tribe of the Ramaytush people, which I believe Ramaytush territory comes all the way down to Stanford, or very close. So we're in the same region. That all changed in 1776 when the Spanish came. The Anza party arrived, and they founded a garrison or a Presidio in the middle of what is now the Presidio today, and that began 250 years of military use of the site. It was the northern end of the Spanish Empire. The Russians were coming, and so the Spanish built a fort there. Then it became the northern end of Mexico, and then the middle of the 20th century it became the most important military site in the west of the United States. And that history, that deep history, I mean, it really was the most important military site in the West, up through the First World War and almost to the Second World War. It's an incredible lens through which you can look at both the history of the Western United States, but also evolving attitudes about land in the Western United States. So it's actually an incredibly important artifact. That long history of military use left an incredible layering of historic architecture. In fact, it's the best collection of historic military architecture and military landscapes in the West. Because of that, in 1962, when it was still an Army base, the Army, it was designated a National Historic Landmark, the entire district. And literally, everything is historic. The curbs, the trees, the fire hydrants, you name it, it's historic. But it's, again, this remarkable tapestry of layers of history all inscribed in this one place. In 1972, when the Golden Gate National Recreation Area was created, luckily, Phil Burton drew a red line on a map that surrounded 114 square miles of the most amazing land, starting at the northern end of Tamaulipas Bay and going all the way down to Woodside. Luckily, when he drew that red line on the map, he included the Presidio. So, and included in the bill that created the GGNRA, a line that said if the land ever became surplus to the needs of the military, it would automatically transfer to the National Park Service instead of transferring to the local jurisdiction and being developed as another fancy neighborhood in San Francisco. Fast forward, 1989, I already mentioned this. In 1989, two really important things happened. In the spring of 1989, the Army decided they were done with the Presidio. Managing a military base that was also a National Historic Landmark District was way too hard. Too many people in their business. So they decided that they were going to let go of it. And they set a deadline of 5 years later to transfer the land to the Park Service. Later that year in the fall, during the first game of the World Series, for those of you who remember, the Battle of the Bay, there was the Loma Prieta earthquake. And that started a really important conversation about elevated freeways, right? Remember, part of the Bay Bridge collapsed, the Cypress structure in Oakland collapsed. Well, of course, the freeway approach to the Golden Gate Bridge was another topic of conversation. And so that began two really important planning processes that are part of the story that I'm trying to tell you tonight. The first is this conversation that the National Park Service led really trying to understand what it meant for this place to be a national park. The second conversation was led by Caltrans. And that was a conversation about what should Doyle Drive be, this elevated freeway that at that time, unbeknownst to me until we started this project, was a 2 out of 100 on the safety scale. It was one of the most dangerous highways in the United States, which was cold comfort after all those times I had driven across it to get into the park. But anyway, so these two big conversations began. And the Park Service began to take a really close look at the Presidio. And what they discovered is the Presidio was a serious mess. There had been decades of underinvestment by the Army. The deferred maintenance backlog at that time was about $1 billion. If they had taken on that responsibility, it would have increased the deferred maintenance backlog in the entire national park system by 50%. So it was a big deal. It was a big undertaking. And the Park Service began to get a little nervous about it, and a move began in Congress to pay down the national debt. Control of the House of Representatives changed. There was a conversation about paying down the national debt, and somebody decided that a good way to do that would be to sell national park sites. And legislation was introduced to sell 12 national park sites across the country, including the Presidio, to pay down the national debt. And it came within 30 votes of passing. So, that was at the very moment that we were trying to get legislation passed to create a new kind of federal agency to manage the Presidio, a new kind of government agency, a new kind of trust. So as a result of that move to sell off the land, a new kind of partnership was created. A partnership between 3 organizations. The National Park Service, you know, because this land is part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. The Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, which is the most successful national parks cooperating association in the United States. They raise money, they support volunteer programs. If you're not a member, I want you all to join because they do so much good in the world. Seriously, they're an incredible organization. And then this newfangled organization, the Presidio Trust. And we were given jurisdiction over 80% of the Presidio. The Park Service retained jurisdiction over 20% of the Presidio, mostly the coastal bits. And the Conservancy was set up as the partner for both organizations. Now the trust was a new, both sort of old and new. It's old insofar as our mission is essentially the same as the National Park Service. It is to preserve for the enjoyment of future generations, future generations, the natural, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources of the Presidio without impairing them. So it's just like every other national park in America. The Organic Act lays it out, same thing. The difficulty is that we had, there was like a garnish on the legislation, which is that we had to become financially self-sufficient within 15 years, and if we didn't, all of the land would be sold and developed. So that demon raised its ugly head again. So the first challenge we had was to really save the place. And we set about doing that by taking a lot of buildings that looked like this, a lot of historic buildings. There are 800 buildings in the Presidio, about 6 million square feet of built space, taking those buildings and restoring them. And in the course of restoring those buildings, we were really restoring a national park community, a new kind of national park community. Because what does it mean to live in a national park? So it was like a little laboratory. We got to impose all of these crazy requirements, like you can't have pets, and you can't plant anything except what's on this list of non-invasive plants in your garden, and all of this great stuff. It was like a big laboratory. But we revived the Presidio by building this national park community, and by supporting the park with the revenue that was generated by all of the leases to all the folks that lived in the park. We also used the transformation of Presidio as an opportunity to undo a lot of bad decisions the Army had made. You know, let's face it, the second half of the 20th century could be cruel architecturally. And there were some really bad decisions that the Army made in the second half of the 20th century. They took a lot of beautiful buildings and did this to them. They took a lot of ensembles of buildings and demolished half of the ensemble and left the other half. A lot of, because again, their job is to defend the country, not preserve a landmark. So we undid a lot of bad decisions. We restored a lot of buildings. We developed very early, in fact, before LEED was around, we developed green preservation guidelines. And so we used those green preservation guidelines to restore all of these buildings to make sure that they were appropriate for a national park, right? The core mission of a national park is to steward the environment. And so in the restoration of these historic properties, we wanted to use green preservation principles and practices. We also got a little bit of a pass from the community. There was some big ugly in the park. Probably the biggest ugly of all was the Letterman Hospital complex and the Letterman Institute of Army Research, which is where all kinds of nasty business happened. So the community rallied around the idea of demolishing this complex and letting us build a new campus. Of course, we partnered with George Lucas and we built the Letterman Digital Arts Campus. Now, this is a really conservative application of the Secretary of the Interior standards for the rehabilitation of historic properties, right? I mean, half the people that come to the park ask me, what year this historic building was built, which it clearly is not an historic building, but to the average visitor, it looks very much like an historic building. But bear in mind, it was very early in our trajectory, and we needed to play it safe. We were in our motherhood and apple pie phase because we had to get to financial self-sufficiency, and so this is one of the big moves that we made early on because it was a bit of the honeymoon period with the public. We could. But also we were beginning to understand what it meant to transform a place like this and do it in a way that welcomed the public. It was complicated. And again, we were sprinting towards financial self-sufficiency. We also came really close to making some really bad decisions. And for those of you who've lived here for a while, you know that we had not one but two very wealthy individuals that came to the park that had amazing collections, that wanted to build museums in the Presidio, and could not get to a good building. Like, how is that? Amazing taste in art, but we could not get a building that was appropriate to the place. And we came very close to, frankly, losing the whole community over these two buildings because the public was outraged. Appropriately, they took us to task, and neither of these things happened. And the truth is, both of these collections ended up where they belonged. And they're now, one has transformed MoMA in San Francisco, and the other is about to open in Exposition Park in Southern California, an amazing new building. If they had brought us that building, it'd be in the Presidio, honestly. Instead, we got the fake Panama Pacific International Exposition building over there. But the point is, our first chapter, so this is a 3-chapter story, right? All good things come in threes. Okay, so the first chapter was all about saving the place. And the good news was we did. We were able to bring together the community to leverage the investment by third parties, to leverage the support of the surrounding neighborhoods because they were more worried about us failing than they were about us succeeding. And we were able to rehabilitate about 4.5 million square feet of the Presidio. We generated enough revenue to credibly argue that we'd made the place financially self-sufficient and saved the Presidio by 2013, which was our first job. But the challenge is we hadn't really stewarded the national park, right? We hadn't really made a national park. We had saved the site, but what we had really done is we had saved a kind of beautiful office park, which is really what the Presidio was at that point. Interestingly enough, as we were working on creating that beautiful office park, we had begun to do a lot of research about the evolution of the Presidio landscape, about the cultural landscape, and that was very much in vogue right then. Especially in the National Park Service, the sort of cultural landscape philosophy and studies, and it was the early days of that whole way of thinking about landscape. And so we had done quite a bit of analysis of the deep history of the place, and we had learned that the site was really even more remarkable than we thought, both in terms of the design landscape, which occupies about 93%, we'll call it 95 just to simplify it, percent of the Presidio was touched by the Army and transformed by the Army in some way. So it's by far the vast majority of the Army. But what we also learned as part of this analysis is there was this tiny piece of the Presidio the Army had never touched. It's roughly 7% of the site. It's these sort of relic natural areas, mostly along the coast, and then these tiny fragments. And what's interesting is those relic natural areas house the most astonishing biodiversity. Over 300 different native plant species. Of those, 21 of them are rare, endangered, and threatened species. So per acre, it's the greatest concentration of special status plant species of any national park in America. So just think about that. It's an Army base. It's in the middle of San Francisco. It's been totally transformed by the Army, and yet it's got more special status plant species per acre than any other national park. Incredibly rich biodiversity, incredibly important, 21 different native plant communities. And these things were heavily, heavily, heavily impacted. They were really kind of, relic areas on the edge. I mean, they were on the brink. So we realized that really the second thing we needed to do was we needed to heal the place. We needed to heal the landscape and focus on saving these relic natural areas, but also asking ourselves, what does it mean to manage, in the same way that we focused on greening the historic buildings, what does it mean to green the historic landscapes of the park? Excuse me. I'm sorry, that probably was really loud. And the problem was, in the world of national parks then, okay, hold on. Okay, in the National Park Service, the prevailing ideology about landscape was still very much informed by what I think of as an 18th century mindset, this sort of romantic era mindset, that there is nature, and there is culture, and never the twain shall meet. Right? And that nature is the absence of culture. It's the absence of people, and there's a hard line. And so most of the landscape stewardship philosophy, the policies hadn't kept up with this philosophy of cultural landscape, right? Which is really about both those things together. Sorry. So we realized very quickly that this was hopeless, using this kind of mindset. And so we began to focus on the idea of an expanded field of natures. Right, the idea that it was possible to tease apart the aesthetic dimensions of nature from the ecological dimensions of nature, and that those things can be mixed and matched in different kind of models of nature. And that by creating an expanded field of notions of nature, it created the opportunity for us to imagine designed historic landscapes that were full of ecological value, because they were delinked from the aesthetic, the aesthetics of nature. So we used that philosophy to build a comprehensive master plan for the Presidio. It broke the Presidio into 3 zones. The native plant community zone, or the natural areas, the historic forest. The Presidio has a 400-acre historic forest that was planted in the 1880s and 1890s, and it was actually, the commanding officer at the time was on the Parks Commission for the city of San Francisco and played a role in creating Golden Gate Park. And he was so inspired by Golden Gate Park, he transformed the Presidio into Golden Gate Park, just kept it an army base. So this forest was planted in the 1880s and 1890s. And then the design landscape, which is all the gray, which is the bulk, it's about 60% of the park. What the master plan tried to do was to strike a balance between preserving what is important historically about the forest and about the design landscape zones, but restoring the natural processes that had been destroyed primarily due to fragmentation, but also because over the years the Army had buried every water body, or Caltrans, had buried every water body in the Presidio, basically putting all of the wet infrastructure, all the natural infrastructure of the park in big 72-inch culverts where they went directly to the bay. And so the vision of the VMP was to reimagine the entire Presidio in ecological terms while preserving what was essential about its history, what was essential about its historic character, the character-defining features of the site. We adopted a philosophy of human-centered design, human-centered restoration. And this is really important because so much of the ideology of restoration and of nature is really about keeping people out. I can't tell you how many in the beginning of my career, how many conversations I had with biologists where I was told the biggest impact is people in the environment. It is the biggest impact. And the disturbance is the worst thing, and no birds will nest within 50 feet of people, and all of this sort of ideological nonsense about nature. And so what we did is we asked ourselves, imagine a world where we reposition people as the solution rather than the problem. Because the truth is you can't have nature in a city without the active management of people, right? It's physically impossible because the city will just swamp any kind of natural process without the active involvement of people. So we adopted this human-centered philosophy that people are the solution, people are not the problem. We embraced the notion of community stewardship, and we engaged thousands and thousands of members of the public in those relic natural areas. And the idea was to help us deal with the negative impacts, but it also was creating a well-educated cohort of citizens, private citizens and young people who are much more principled than their parents, and always take home everything they learn and shame their parents around their behavior. So we always start with young people. But that we embrace this notion of engaging the community in the stewardship and restoration of these natural areas, both because we were desperate for labor because we had no money, right? But also because we wanted to build. We needed people to understand how incredibly brilliant and fragile and amazing the landscape of the Presidio was, because most people just thought of it as an old abandoned army base. We engaged in really active education and outreach, but also experimentation. Because one of the really important things that we learned early on is that people do have a really negative impact on the natural ecosystems of the Presidio. But it was mostly because of a lack of awareness, and it was mostly because the underlying impulse was a positive one. So let me give you an example. This is literally one of the weirdest things we've ever done, okay, but I'm going to share it with you. So Mountain Lake is a lake in the Presidio. It's the only remaining natural lake in all of GGNRA, in all 114 square miles, and there it is sitting in San Francisco. And for generations, young people had dumped their unwanted goldfish and red-eared sliders in the lake. So who knew? I had no idea that goldfish turned into these like monster carp. They like revert. But the lake was being destroyed by these monster carp and by red-eared sliders, literally, just like they were destroying the lake. And so and the lake was dying, it was eutrophying, it was in horrible shape. So we wanted to save the lake, but we realized that we had to get at the root cause of that. And so we created two things. We created a Mountain Lake Pledge, and we went to every school within a couple miles of Mountain Lake, and we got every child to sign on to the Mountain Lake Pledge, every fourth grader, that they were not going to dump their goldfish. They were not going to free willy in Mountain Lake. And not only that, they were not going to let their parents do it either. Again, shaming their parents, right? But then the other thing we did, because there are always folks, they forget, right? And again, this is an impulse, right? It's like you want to free your loved goldfish rather than flush your loved goldfish down the toilet, right? I mean, we all did it when we were kids, right? So we created this amnesty box, right, over here. Where people could come and they could actually deposit their beloved goldfish or their turtle, and we would come and we literally pick them up. So we all have a lot of goldfish and a lot of turtles, but my staff comes and they actually pick them up and they rescue them and we take them and we find good homes for them. But it was about embracing the underlying impulse, which is about a love of nature, and channeling it in a more positive way. Right? So we did all kinds of stuff like this, sort of crazy harebrained stuff like this, but it's really about getting to the root cause, finding that way you can touch a young person and inspire them to want to do the right thing, so that they're working in kind of collaboration, if you will, with natural process rather than at odds with it. All right, let's keep going. We created, working with the California Academy of Sciences and actually 11 cities across the country, we created something called the UBIF, which I can't remember what it means, but it's a Urban Biodiversity Index framework. It's a way of measuring urban biodiversity using INAT and other citizen science tools, so that we can understand not only the biodiversity of these natural areas which we monitor so carefully, but the whole landscape of the Presidio. And then we crowdsource that data so that we really have an understanding of what's going on in the historic forest, what species are in the historic forest, or how about, the main parade ground, or whatever kind of foundation planning. And it yielded incredibly valuable data about what was going on ecologically in a way, again, we could never have done because we just didn't have the resources to actually do that kind of work. Building this kind of relationship with the community allowed us to do some truly transformative work. And again, I'll go back to Mountain Lake. Because we slowly built this relationship with the surrounding, because there are houses that face Mountain Lake on one side, highly visible. Hundreds of thousands of people a day drive by on Highway 1 and stare right at the lake. So, but because we had built this relationship with the community, we were able to undertake pretty dramatic things. We were able to clear cut all the eucalyptus trees along the edge of the lake. We were able to net about 10,000 fish out of the lake. It turned out there are 10,000 fish, including a pair of 5-foot-long sturgeon. Who knew? The big question I have is, how did they get there? Mostly a lot of smallmouth bass, but this is where working with the community is really interesting, because we netted them all, And the reason the public let us take the fish out of the lake and ultimately poison the few that remained is because we agreed to send them to a reptile rescue rather than killing them all. So they all live up in Sonoma County in ponds on vineyards, it turns out. Pretty good life. But you know, again, these are the kinds of trade-offs you have to make in order to build the trust of the community and also to engage them so that you're then able to do these sort of transformative things. So the upshot is we were able to take things like this. This is this derelict pump station that used to be on the shores of Mountain Lake, remove that pump station, remove the eucalyptus trees behind it, and restore the entire edge using, you know, hundreds of native species. We were able to excavate about 8 feet of contaminated sediment out of the bottom of Mountain Lake. We were able to net all the fish. We were able to reintroduce a whole suite of native species, including the endangered or threatened western pond turtle, which just actually last year finally started reproducing naturally in the lake, which is really exciting. Similarly, we were left with many gifts by the Army, and one of the many gifts we got were a lot of landfills, 13 of them to be in fact, and thousands of sites, contaminated sites. But these landfills were interesting because the Army had actually built them all over creeks. And so we negotiated a transfer of responsibility from the Army to the Trust to do all the remediation for these creeks, and these landfills. That created the opportunity for us not only to remove all the contamination, but to use those funds to actually restore the creeks. And so we were able, using that funding, to take, you know, landfill sites like this and stitch them all together and restore most of the Tennessee Hollow watershed, which is a 280-acre watershed that's located in the middle of San Francisco, which is a really unique experience to be able to have. But I want to point something out really important. There are people in this picture, and there's a path, and this isn't the one. There's usually a dog in the picture I show, because one of the things that we are always doing when we're restoring sites like this is we're trying to understand what the public wants. What's the experience they want to have? Because we want to give them that experience so they aren't intruding into our restored natural areas. And the way you do that is you create a good experience for them too. Rather than, so much of what ecological restoration has always been about, which is like, this is the really sensitive habitat, stay away. This is like, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? What do you want to see? What kind of experience do you want to have? And building that into your restoration strategy so that they're not inclined to jump the fence and, you know, bring their dog into our very precious pond and kill all our cute little tadpoles. But this sort of approach, again, this human-centered restoration approach, informs really everything we do. When we do restoration, these are all native species that we planted. We plant the pretty ones along the path, which is, again, kind of heretical thinking when you're doing pure restoration. But the fact is, we want people to think these restoration sites are beautiful because we all index the world through our eyes. So we want them to be beautiful. So we plant, you know, pretty flowering things right along the path, and then all the other maybe not so pretty but really important things are planted just behind those pretty things. So that's the sort of first thing we did, which was both about protecting these relic natural areas, but also growing them and expanding their footprint. But the other thing we did, because most of the Presidio is not natural area and will never be natural area because it's so sensitive and important historic fabric, is we really focused on what I think of as greening the matrix, like greening the historic landscapes, greening the forest, taking all of that stuff that the Army built over time and thinking about ways that we can both, again, preserve the essential historic character of those things, but do it in a way that improves the environmental performance of those landscapes. You know, teases apart the basically historic forms from the ecological values that the plants that you use to build those forms can provide. So we developed a whole series of new garden archetypes. They were based on the pre-contact landscapes, the soil conditions, the aspect, the species that existed, asking ourselves, well, how can we use those to recreate these historic landscapes, but bring like things like baccharis into those landscapes, which are like, you know, they're like the blueberries of the insect world, right? They're like plant food. They're like a superfood for insects. We implemented a whole host of ecological horticulture practices. So these are practices, maintenance practices, that are really about being mindful of the impact of maintenance on insects and on birds. So for example, during bird nesting season, we cut nothing. For 6 months of the year, things get all unruly and out of control and wild. And then comes the end of August when everything's done and there's like this frenzy of cutting and tree removal and all this madness. But those practices are really important because, ironically, it's the maintenance activities that have the really big impact on nature. It's not people walking around. It's all this hedging and trimming and pulling and all that junk poisoning and all the stuff we do in traditional horticulture. So asking ourselves, what are new ways to think about that, and how do we mitigate the impact of those practices on the wild things that live all over in the park? Now, we know they live all over in the park because we adopted what I think of as a science-based approach to understanding the place. So, again, the way, never the twain shall meet, right? There's restoration ecology and all of those practices of land stewardship in natural areas like monitoring and, science and all that stuff. And then there's design landscapes. And we're all about mowing and blowing and going, right? They're like two totally different worlds. And so what we try to do is pick and choose the best of each. And so, for example, the idea of monitoring in the natural areas, well, we monitor all over. And we use our learnings from monitoring all over to help us inform and create a whole series of adaptive management strategies. So for example, we collar all of our coyotes in the park. And so we can understand where they are, where they're denning, what they're doing, what they're eating. We have all these intrusive, crazy cameras, so we literally know what they're eating. And we use that to actually close parts of the park. We've developed all of these strategies for actually escorting coyotes from one den to the other so that they don't den next to neighborhoods where there are lots of dogs. They den in the middle of the golf course where no dogs are allowed. And so their coyote pups will be safe and will mitigate the impact, the potential conflicts. Because coyotes have such a hugely positive impact on the ecology of sites like this by eliminating a lot of the rodents and raccoons and skunks and things that predate birds. So hugely important role they play in the ecology of these landscapes, and they're everywhere, right? They're throughout the landscape. So using these strategies, both focusing on these relic natural areas, expanding the footprint of those natural areas, but also focusing on the matrix and greening and thinking, reimagining that in different ways, we've had a lot of success. We've quadrupled the acres of natural area in the park. And stitched together, you remember that map, there were all these gaps. We've eliminated a lot of those gaps and created more continuity. I mentioned we have 21 special status plant species. All of those populations have increased, in some cases dramatically. I mean, I think San Francisco, La Cincha, there were like 50 of them, and now there are 150,000 of them. I mean, it was something nutty like that. And what's interesting is that we've seen an increase in biodiversity, but not only in the native plant community zone, in the historic forest zone, and in the design landscape zone as well. So we've seen this big uptick in biodiversity across the whole place. So that strategy has worked well in terms of preserving the place. But there was a missing piece. And this is the third piece of the puzzle. And the thing that was missing was really the reason that urban national parks were created. So national parks have, from the beginning, served an audience that is disproportionately white, that is disproportionately wealthy, that tend to be older and tend to be more educated than the general public. And that's all the way back to the 19th century. I mean, that is forever. Because of that, in the 1960s and 70s, the national park system realized they were losing market share. As America was growing more diverse, as our country was changing, a smaller and smaller percentage of Americans were actually using national parks. And so in the 1970s, they created urban national parks. And the idea of urban national parks was to bring national park experiences to urban audiences. The problem is they made a misjudgment. And the misjudgment was by simply bringing national parks to cities, you would serve those communities. When in fact, those communities had no relationship to the idea of national parks and the kinds of experiences you could have in national parks. Simply preserving the land wasn't enough. And so GGNRA and the Presidio, for its early years, served that same small segment of the American population. And in 2008, we did this very, very comprehensive visitor survey, intercept survey and phone surveys, comprehensive survey. And what we found was that even in the Bay Area, even in the Presidio, which is right in the middle of San Francisco, 85% of our visitors were white. They were disproportionately older. They were disproportionately people with high income, and they mostly lived within a quarter mile of the Presidio. Which, for those of you who know where the Presidio is like surrounded by the wealthiest people literally on earth, okay? I mean, we have more billionaires living next to the Presidio than I think any other national park in America. But this was completely at odds with the reason that this land was protected in the first place, because it was protected to bring national park experiences to traditionally underrepresented urban communities. So we realized that though we had succeeded in saving the Presidio, and though we had succeeded in healing the place and restoring its natural ecosystems, that there was a third really critical thing that needed to be done. And that was really finally getting to that place where the Presidio was truly a place that welcomed everyone. So we started by listening, because we had to get to the root cause. Why is it that we had built this incredible park right in the middle of San Francisco? People could walk to the Presidio. They could take multiple buses to the Presidio. Why was it that we still had a visitation that was 85% white and predominantly wealthy, as opposed to reflecting the full diversity of San Francisco? And we learned a lot. We learned that the fact that it was a military site was actually a big barrier, because not everyone in our community has the same kind of loving relationship with the military and with people in uniform in general that some people do. So the legacy of military service. I know for myself, when I was a boy, I came here to camp. There was a Boy Scout camp here. And when you came in, you literally were, I mean, this isn't a very menacing, this looks really nice, right? Really great. When I came in, there was an MP with a gun. And he said, "What's your business here?" And you know, if you couldn't say what your business was, or if you didn't look like that MP, you didn't get in. So, and generations of people in San Francisco had had this experience of the guys in, you know, I think of them as guys with guns at the gate, right? And that left this memory about the place as a place for others. I mean, it looks like a country club when you drive up. Every gate is a big fancy gate, you know, big stone columns, big wall. There's another kind of wall, which I mentioned earlier. It's this wall of wealth, right? And I can't tell you how many people we had these interviews, and they'd say, "Well, you know, the Presidio is great, but it's not for us." And I'd say, "Well, what do you mean?" They'd say, "Well, it's for them." And I'd say, "Well, who's them?" And they'd say, "Well, it's all the rich people that live around it. You know, that's what the Presidio is for. It's for them and not for us." The fact that we had to be financially self-sufficient, which means that we have to charge an ungodly amount of money for every square foot of built space in the Presidio, because that's the only way we can make money. And by legislation, the square footage we can ever have in the park is limited to the amount the Army had when they left. And so we have to squeeze as much money as possible out of every square foot of building. Well, that means they're literally among the most expensive housing units. I mean, we have like these general's houses with servants' quarters, literally, that rent for $22,000 a month. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous. But it's the only way the park survives, right? That means it's got a reputation as a place, again, it reinforces this notion, it's not a place for me, it's a place for them. The history of the place itself, so this very history that we're preserving, is really complicated, right? I mean, starting with where we began, 1776, the Spanish came and the genocide of the Ohlone began. Well, there are multiple iterations of that same kind of history that's layered into the history of this place. You know, the Buffalo Soldiers and the racism and segregation that existed in the Army up until the Second World War, or the Japanese-American internment order during the Second World War. Well, that incarceration order was actually issued from the Presidio by General DeWitt. So the complexity of this history and the impact of that history on the very communities that we were trying to reach was a huge thing, a huge barrier that we had to overcome. And then lastly, the very historic character that we were trying to protect was a huge barrier, because it is really sterile. I mean, it is this like severe, sterile kind of, you know, that's because, again, it was a utilitarian landscape, right? The Army built. And the public kept pointing to it and saying, "Why would I want to be here, right? This place, it's so boring. There are no picnic tables. Why don't you put in picnic tables?" Well, the whole thing's a National Historic Landmark District. It's really hard, you know, it's hard to do, blah, blah, blah. Where are the bathrooms? You know, all that stuff. So that was really important. And what it made us realize is that we had really important work that we had to do. The really important work started with the transformation of Crissy Field. This is, for those of you who know Crissy, this is the before. Crissy Field, 100 acres of asphalt and hard packed dirt. The Conservancy and the Park Service tackled Crissy Field and transformed it into what it is today, which is a really beloved urban park site. And it's important because it symbolically, for the public, it was the moment when the Presidio stopped being an office park and started being a national park. In part because of the deep engagement that happened as a part of that process of building that project. Then we began a whole series of activities that grew out of what we had learned in that listening session and also in the Crissy Field process. So we learned that access was a huge barrier. So we created a free shuttle and a new transit system and multilingual information about how to access the park and how to use the park. We heard that people didn't know what to do in the Presidio. They actually didn't really understand what a national park was because they'd never been there. And so they wanted us to create kind of gateway national park. It's like a gateway drug, right? The Presidio becomes the gateway drug to national parks. So, when we asked them what it was, it's like, well, we want campground, and we want campfires, and we want to go hiking, and we want to have those, we want to go bird watching and those things. And so we created those experiences, but we did it in a way that in conjunction with that, we created programming that allowed us to build a bridge between traditionally underrepresented communities that had never had those experiences, they just knew about them, and the experiences themselves. So for example, we created a Camping at the Presidio program that was designed to serve young people in Title I schools, low-income kids. They'd never been in the outdoors, and we brought them here, gave them a ranger, gave them s'mores, gave them a campfire, literally gave them like that national park experience as a way of demystifying and building a sense of confidence and a sense of mastery. We tried to humanize the crazy sterile landscape. So this is one of many examples. We worked with then Rebar, now Gell Associates, and designed the share chairs, which are like giant chair, picnic table toys that kids throw around and play. But what they did is they activate those sterile kind of military landscapes that we heard so much about, and they transformed the main parade into a giant like Tonka set, on the weekends. And they come out every spring, and it's like spring has arrived, the share chairs are out on the main parade. We moved away from what is so often the approach in national parks. There's this notion in national parks that interpreters are experts, right? And they know best how to tell the story of a place. They know how to deliver program, and they do. They're really good at it. But the problem with that is that it's more powerful if you actually engage the community as partners in the telling, in the co-creation of the public realm, rather than making it be something that's imposed by experts, something that you co-create. And so we really engage the community in the act of redefining what the public realm of the Presidio was. And we adopted an approach of what we call Park as Platform, where the Presidio is simply a platform. We help community-based organizations use that platform, and they bring their programs, they bring their communities with them, and it's a way to really activate the space in a way that is more relevant and more authentic, especially to communities that, again, don't want to come here and learn about, the history of I don't know what. They just want to come and be in nature and enjoy the outdoors and have an experience that's authentic to themselves. We wrestled with the past. And we had the good fortune to work with a whole bunch of different community-based organizations over the years to create exhibitions and programming along with those exhibitions that revealed this history and revealed, frankly, some of the dark chapters of the history of the Presidio. So this is the exclusion exhibit, which is an exhibit that's up in the Officers Club right now, which is about the Japanese-American internment order that was issued in the Second World War. We also partnered with artists. So this is a work by Andy Goldsworthy, Tree Fall that's located in one of the historic buildings. We tried to work with artists to create some new stories. So not just looking backwards, but also looking forwards and asking ourselves, how do we tell the stories and reveal the complexity of a landscape like the Presidio, which is so multi-layered and multi-dimensional? And art became a really great way to do that. And lastly, we prioritized where we spent our money. And this is really hard for a federal agency to do. As you can imagine, there are all these issues around fairness and how you spend your money and all that good stuff. But we managed to figure out a way, working with our partners, and we really prioritized investing our limited resources in young people, particularly young people, low-income children, children that historically have not had access to the outdoors and to nature, hoping that by prioritizing those young people, they would begin to both build a relationship themselves, but also bring their families back to build a relationship with the place. So we did all that, and we met with really a lot of success, and we began to see the demographics of our visitation change. It was no longer just neighbors. There was more diversity. There was more income diversity. There was more age diversity. But we continued to hear the same thing over and over and over again from the public. And it usually started with, you know, the Presidio is the most confusing place I've ever visited. And every time I come, I get lost. And it really makes it hard to enjoy. Or every time I come to the Presidio, I can't find a bathroom. It always started with every time I come to the Presidio. And then there was something that came. And essentially what it was saying is, look, you need a Yosemite Valley. Right? We don't know where to begin our experience. We don't know how to navigate this place. We don't have the most basic infrastructure because this sterile historic place doesn't really allow you to build all that stuff, right? So we realized we needed our own little Yosemite Valley, a place where people could begin and end their experience, where the community could come together and just be together and enjoy the place. And the opportunity emerged, so this is going all the way back to 1989, but I'm not going to tell a story quite this long. Back to Doyle Drive, because in 1989, again, I mentioned this second really important conversation started about how we're going to replace the Presidio, how we're going to place Doyle Drive, which was built in the 30s in conjunction with the Golden Gate Bridge. And when it was built, because it was an Army base, the Army wanted it to be off the ground. They didn't care how it looked, which was really clear from the way it looked. And all they wanted was they didn't want it to get in their way. And so they built this elevated freeway. So Caltrans' first proposal after the Loma Prieta earthquake, again, everybody's focused on elevated freeways. This was a 2 out of 100. Everyone agreed it had to be rebuilt. So the first proposal was to rebuild the identical freeway twice as wide. So it was going to be an elevated freeway, and twice as wide, not because there were going to be twice as many lanes, but because modern freeway standards require it to be twice as wide. You need to add shoulders, the lanes are wider. You know, you used to put cones on it and change I mean, that's why it was so dangerous, right? They just moved the cones over, and opposing traffic was separated by little cones, and that's all. Luckily, the community knew better, and they held Caltrans accountable, just like they held us accountable, you know, when the Fisher Museum was proposed. They came together and rallied around a vision for not a freeway, but a parkway that was developed by Michael Painter, landscape architect Michael Painter. And the Presidio Parkway vision was the idea that the freeway, instead of separating the park, should actually stitch the park together. And it did that in a number of ways. It created an opportunity. No, is there a? I'm sure there is. I'm just going to wave. To take the marsh and extend it under the freeway to connect to the Tennessee Hollow watershed. But it also included these 2 sets of cut and cover tunnels that connected Crissy Field up to the main post, which was great news. Because the main post and Crissy Field were the 2 most public parts of the Presidio. They were the place it was like the civic heart. And there had been literally a freeway separating the 2 of them, this wall separating the 2 of them up to that point. But Caltrans really, they didn't have much of a vision. They had a great vision. They embraced the Painter plan. They suddenly had an incredible vision for what the roadway could be. But, you know, they're really about roadways, right? And so they didn't really have much of a vision for what the park should be. That was really exciting to us. And literally, this is one of their renderings. And they said they were going to plant 14 acres of grass. Because it's a 14-acre site, they're going to plant 14 acres of grass. And we realized that we could do a little better than that. We could do better than 14 acres of grass. But what we really realized is that because of where this is located, between Crissy Field and the main post, the 2 most civic parts of the Presidio, that this, and because it was 14 acres of new land, Doyle Drive or the Parkway project had taken the hit in terms of historic preservation for destroying the integrity of the site. So suddenly we had this like 14 acres of land where we could do all the stuff that the public had wanted for so long, but that we couldn't do because of the sensitivity of the landscape. So we decided that we were going to take this work over from Caltrans, and we were going to launch a public campaign to reimagine what those 14 acres could be and how they could function as the heart of the Presidio. So we launched what we called the Imagine phase. And I put out a call. I sent letters to 100 firms all around the world, the best architects and landscape architects. I got 28 proposals, and we selected 5 firms. And we hired those 5 firms to develop concepts. This was the best deal I ever got in my career, because these firms were such extraordinary firms, and they did far more than we compensated them for. So this is my pitch. These are amazing firms. They did amazing work. And they deserve a debt of gratitude from all of us just because they did such incredible work. So we launched this Imagine phase. The 5 firms, we structured the competition so that the 5 firms were developing concepts. Each one was developing a concept for the site. But we created these opportunities. It was not like your regular competition. It started by all 5 of the firms coming together for a long weekend on the Presidio. So they all had to stare at each other across tables. They all had opportunities to interact with the public that weekend and in the course of the competition. And I met with each of them every week because I was determined that what they developed would actually be useful and would actually speak to and respond to the needs of the community. And so it was a very unusual competition. We got 5 incredible schemes. These are just images from 2 of them, on the left by West 8, on the right by CMG. 5 incredibly distinctive, incredibly interesting schemes. We took those schemes and we tested them. We built a design lab in the Presidio where we staffed it with a young architecture student, actually, a couple of young architecture students. And they facilitated the public providing input about these schemes in the design lab. We not only captured people that were coming to visit the Presidio and just hanging out and wanting to have a good time, but we also worked with our community partners to bring literally over 1,000 individuals from neighborhoods that traditionally are not well represented in our visitation into the park to give us feedback about the schemes as well. We also took the schemes out into the community. So we went to visit the 5 neighborhoods, again, that are least well represented in our visitation. So for those of you who know the city, the Bayview and Hunters Point, the Mission, Western Addition, Chinatown, and the kind of southern edges of the Sunset, and 6, south of Market. So we took the schemes out, we met with folks in the community, and we asked them, we tested the schemes and we asked them for their ideas. And we got so much good feedback. I mean, literally thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of feedback. But it was amazing how consistent it was. The things that the community needed. They wanted something, an experience that was so unique that it was worth coming across town, right? Because San Francisco is a park within 10 minutes of every single citizen. So why should they come all the way, get on the bus and spend an hour to come across town to the Presidio when they could just go to the park down the street? So they wanted a unique experience. They wanted basically a space where the community, they could just hang out with their families because San Francisco is so darn expensive. We heard a lot from people about young people and how hard it was to raise a family and how hard it was to grow up and all the challenges of growing up in San Francisco, especially in some of those neighborhoods that I just mentioned. I love this this was my favorite quote of all. It was at this one workshop. Make it a place where we can eat with the same view as the folks in Pacific Heights. And they said it actually a little more rudely. They said, I want to have dinner with the same view as the billionaires in Pacific Heights. That's literally what they said. So this is edited for, a family audience. And then lastly, we want a place where people feel welcome. That people really, we heard so much again about why the Presidio does not feel welcoming at all. And the other thing that we got, not only this feedback, we actually got a scheme. So the community voted, and 80% of the people who participated in the process, we had 10,000 people participate in this process, 80% of them chose the scheme by James Corner, by field operations. So we got all this important feedback. We got a scheme, And we started the design process. And we created this design process in a way so that the public continued to be able to participate. We also did a lot of things. We prototyped things and did experiments. Like this is a pop-up version of the outpost, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. We experimented for several summers, understanding how kids interact with nature and explore. We had an exhibition called My Park Moment, where we crowdsourced photographs of people in nature from literally around the world. And people shared their experiences about what experiences in nature were important to them. We added a number of features based on their feedback, like a campfire circle, like the outpost, which we'll see in a minute, like a new field station, a drop-in environmental education center. There were two big barriers. One big barrier was Caltrans had to build the new road, and that was delayed several times. And the other big barrier was we had to raise the money. We had to raise $98 million to build this project because we had no money. And we partnered with the Conservancy. They raised the money. But we used this delay, this was a several-year delay, to actually do a number of things. We used it to build out our ecosystem of partners so we could more fully represent the diversity of the community. We worked with those partners to co-create an opening season of programs and events that actually reflected the diversity of the community. We created something called the Presidio Activators, which was a fellowship we gave to 13 different leaders of different community-based organizations. It was a year-long fellowship, and they advised us on every aspect of the operations of the tunnel tops, every aspect of the design, the signage, the language, everything. We created a pop-up food program designed to reflect the diversity of the Bay Area, primarily creating a space for new food entrepreneurs, many of them immigrants, many of them women, to have a chance at building a reputation for themselves and creating a food program that reflects the diversity of the Bay Area. All of that led up to opening day, which was last July, July 17th. This is a picture from that day before the crowds descended. And the project that we opened was really about three primary things. The first, it responded to the needs that we heard for so long by creating a new visitor gateway where you are welcomed, you understand that you're in Ramaytush land, where you can catch the bus or catch a bike, where you can learn what you can do at the new visitor center, where you can get out of the cold. You all know what San Francisco's like in the summer. It's freezing, right? You can get out of the cold in this beautiful pavilion designed by EHDD. You can sit around the campfire and experience that kind of national park experience of a ranger talk with s'mores, et cetera. The second big move that JCFO built was to create over the tunnels themselves this series of play meadows surrounded by gardens and picnic areas and seating, this sort of community commons that created a space the public could come and enjoy and spend the day, full of play meadows where people can hang out and where we can have active programming designed to sustain that kind of active programming. Picnic areas, every kind of picnic table. My favorites are the single-sided ones, so everyone has a view, which I thought was just pure genius. A cliff walk that takes advantage of the grade change at the northern edge of the tunnels, where the grade drops away, to create this platform that provides the most extraordinary views of the San Francisco Bay and downtown skyline. And playful things that JCFO did, like the driftwood benches. All of the furniture on the entire site is built out of repurposed wood from the Presidio forest, the trees that we remove. We milled about 140,000 linear feet of cypress to build all of the furniture on the site. And then the last big move was building a youth campus. I talked earlier about youth and the importance of youth. And so down here at the lower level, the level of Chrissy, a new youth campus, I think of as sort of an engine for building future stewards. And it has three really important components. First is the outpost, one part adventure playground, one part natural environment, designed to allow kids to take beneficial risks and challenge themselves, and in the course of challenging themselves, actually develop a deep emotional connection to nature if they don't break too many bones. But literally, it's a whole thing organized around the idea of risk. The second thing was a new field station. If the outpost is really about gross motor skills and connecting to the outdoors by using your gross motor skills, the field station is really about using your senses to connect to nature, and engaging your mind and your fine motor skills. And so these two things together are designed to serve every kind of child, because we know children are really different. They're neurologically different. They connect to nature differently. And those are two different sides. They're sort of the alter egos of each other. And then lastly, we built an expanded Chrissy Field Center, which is a leadership development program, a leadership development center for young people, serves primarily low-income children, Title I schools, and serves about 30,000 young people a year, and helps them develop leadership skills so they can go on and have careers in the environment or whatever they choose, but informed by their experience here in this national park. And as I mentioned earlier, this whole campus is really designed to create an engine to take these young people and connect them to nature and the outdoors and inspire them to want to be good stewards for the planet. So really, most fundamentally, what this place, the result of all of this is pretty simple. Over the last few years, we've taken 180 acres of asphalt located in this area and turned it into the heart of a new national park that's really designed to serve everyone in our community. And what's really exciting to me is it's worked. In our last visitor survey, comprehensive visitor survey, what we saw is that our visitation has shifted from being predominantly white, predominantly wealthy, predominantly elderly and well-educated, to really coming within 1 or 2 percentage points of reflecting the diversity of the Bay Area, both in terms of ethnic diversity, in terms of income diversity, and in terms of age diversity. It's work that never ends, but it's incredibly, incredibly important, this sort of milestone in the evolution of the place, because it means that we've finally, truly achieved the purpose for which these lands were preserved, which is to bring national park experiences to everyone in our community. So thank you.
So thank you, Michael. Wonderful talk. We all should go visit the Presidio. We really only have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if somebody has a question they'd like to answer, go.
Yeah.
Before, at the very beginning, about poison. Are you still using poisons?
No. No, but the Army's used a lot of them. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
But we have this with furniture. Like, is there any maintenance issue, like dogs pee on it or anything like that?
Wow, are there maintenance issues? Yeah, so many. No, I mean, you know,
Just using it for other purposes.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about those benches, you know, the ones that are sort of undulating, I mean, you can do anything you want on those benches. And they're open 24 hours. I don't even want to know some of the things that happen on them. But you know, the wood is so stable. I mean, cypress is such good wood, and it ages really well, and it's actually really dense. And so, you know, so far they've worked really well. They're not splintering. They're actually working really well. So, but yeah, we have pretty well-behaved dogs, you know. Yeah. No, great question. Yes?
You were talking about how you built this outpost that's built around like teaching children and encouraging them to take risks. But then how did you get that around OSHA and all the safety requirements of California?
Yeah. So how did we get the outpost built around all the requirements? So the really interesting thing is the outpost meets code. We had a playground inspector involved the whole way, and they inspected every single thing, every feature. It meets ADA. Built into every single feature, there's an accessible way for a young person to interact with the work. And so it meets actually all the codes and all the requirements. It's just made of natural materials, and it's designed to deliver certain kinds of challenging experiences. But we wanted to challenge the kids, not kill them, really. So we wanted to be really careful. And so, yeah, it's all been inspected and everything. Yeah. So.
Do you find any resistance in the planning process from the wealthy residents? And do they change their attitude? How did they react after the park was built?
Yeah, so how did our wealthy neighbors respond after the park was built? They're so grateful, truly. Yeah, I mean, so grateful because, you know, what they all realize is the alternative would have been the biggest real estate development project they had ever seen. And so the fact that their neighborhoods are still have all this open space in the middle of them has made them huge advocates. And in fact, the only way we got the tunnel tops built was through the generosity of many of the people that live in the surrounding neighborhood, you know, who are really committed to this vision of an urban national park. So, okay.
Thank you, yeah.
Oh,
Thanks, everybody.
all right, thank you, everyone.